All right, so today we are going over the cervical spine. This is a much gentler lecture than the last 2 days have been. But we're going to kind of finish talking about until now we've talked a lot about postural distortions. We talked a little bit about upper cross syndrome yesterday, which is that hunched posture with the forward head. But today we're going to finish talking about that because the muscles in the neck that often cause that forward head posture, those are mostly part of your cervical spine. So we are going to look at mostly the upper neck today, although it obviously we can't talk about this without talking about anything below it, right? So the conversation will sort of shift sometimes to look at curvatures of our spines and things like that. So 24 vertebrae are going to be here in like the area that is your cervical vertebrae, that's your C1 through 7, and your thoracic vertebrae, which is up top. There's a lot of little spinal nerves, and there's a whole bunch of little tiny intrinsic muscles. We are primarily going to be looking at the large muscles that actually cause like a lot of movement, but there are like lots of like little transverse spinalis muscles, little tiny ones in between each of the vertebrae. The little pieces of the individual parts of your multifidus, for instance. But like I said, we're mostly going to be looking at things like our upper trapezius, our sternocleido, our levator scapulae, things like that. So when we're talking about neck pain, pain in the neck, not to just use the phrase, we are talking about pain in the upper cervical section, or we're talking about like pain in the back of the head, which is also very, very common, where people will get things like tension headaches. So 2/3 of the population are going to experience neck pain at some point. Women are actually more likely to deal with this than men are, mostly because of lower bone density in women. So because estrogen can sometimes play with how calcium absorbs, calcium is absorbed onto the skeletal system, and like a lot of times there will be like a limited vitamin D and things like that. Osteoporosis is much, much, much more common amongst women than it is compared to men. And we're actually going to see that. So tomorrow is our final, and then we're going to be going into our special populations class starting on Thursday. I was like, what's today? So on Thursday, we'll be going into PFT 106, which is special populations. In that class, we'll be talking about things like osteoporosis. We'll be talking about like how to work with like cancer patients who are in remission, diabetics, seniors, children, things like that. So one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about osteoporosis is how it is much more common in women. And that's just because of how hormonal changes can sort of play with things as we get older. And so we'll see that. We'll see women are more likely to have some type of disc herniation or fracture in their cervical spine. So herniated disc, again, kind of going back to similar to how we were talking about it when we talked about the lumbopelvic hip complex, is sometimes people call it a slip disc, some people call it a bulging disc, right? But what it is where the vertebrae have these little impact centers in between each of them, and that is basically this little fluid-filled sac here made of fibrocartilage with this material in the middle called a nuclear pulposus. And what will happen is that sometimes tears that sac. If the density gets too low and then the discs actually start like collapsing in on each other, there's less space between the discs now. And because there's less space, that can sometimes tear that little sac, it gets pinched in between the bones, and then that material starts leaking out. And when it leaks out, it can touch a nerve. And that can cause like a lot of pain. This is actually what, it can sometimes happen, from like traumatic events as well. This is what happened to Peyton Manning. If you remember how he had to get like neck surgery, he had a herniated disc in his cervical spine because he had fractured one of his cervical vertebrae. I don't remember which one. But this material starts leaking out. It causes like a lot of pain. So that can sometimes result as like numbness or tingling, and it's usually going to travel down to wherever that nerve root is heading. So if you ever look at like, let's see here, nerves and vertebrae. If you look at like what sections control what, there's actually kind of a good picture here that kind of shows it. You can see where it's like controlling different parts of the body. This cervical section would also travel up the head. but a better one. Nerves and tracts throughout the body. There we go. This is a pretty good one here. So you can see how like this is going to branch out, right? So each of these little sections here, that's where they actually travel. Oh, there we go. This is great. And so, thoracic vertebrae kind of controls all this area, and then like the bottom parts of your lumbar, and then like your sacrum and stuff. This is why your sciatic pain runs down the back of your leg generally. You can see like, there's sort of a difference between like the fronts of your legs and the backs here. And then like your arms here. Very, very common have neck pain that travels down the arm. In fact, one common condition you're going to look at in capstone is called thoracic um, outlet syndrome. And thoracic outlet syndrome is basically the sciatica of the arm. And what happens actually is where a nerve gets pinched under your collarbone and your pec minor, because it gets so tight it draws you into posture. And then that nerve causes like tingling and burning sensations that travel down your arm. And people will get pain in their arm, and it scares the crap out of them because it feels like you're having a heart attack. Like pain in the arm is sometimes a sign of a heart attack. And so people will get this thoracic outlet syndrome. And it's because like this nerve basically gets pinched due to overactive, underactive muscles. So how do we fix stuff like that? Well, again, we got to draw our clients back into neutral posture. Your body has plenty of space for all these nerves to move around. It was designed to have nerves running throughout your body, but we, through our habits, pull it into posture that looks like this, that causes like, that space to be eliminated. We cause too much space on one side of things and not enough space on the other. Kind of like one of the reasons we looked at the QL in the knees, right? That's like a grinding of these two condyles on the knee and a gap on these two condyles of the knee. And so not great. So when I keep saying upper cross syndrome, right? So what I'm talking about, and again, the reason this is upper cross syndrome is because it's in the upper body and it is a crossing motion. So we see tight muscles right back here up high and weak muscles down below it. Meanwhile, in the front of the body, we see the exact opposite. We see tight muscles down here and weak muscles up above. And so that often results in a rounded shoulder situation, which we kind of talked about yesterday, and a forward head posture, right? So that is that classic upper cross syndrome. So what we need to do is we need to strengthen the weak stuff here and here, and we need to stretch out our overactive stuff here and here. Today's kind of a nice lesson, by the way, because we get to do, these are some stretches that are very easy for me to demo on call, and you guys can join at home, and it feels really great once you're all stretched out. Especially because you're on like a freaking computer or whatever, or a tablet or a phone right now. So you're probably like, oh yeah, bad posture is bad. Okay, I can understand it. So it'll be nice to kind of stretch all that out today. So that is sort of what we're talking about when we talk about like upper cross syndrome. It's this poor posture we're talking about here. And you can see, this actually doesn't even, like, if you were to remove this and just look at this as a picture, some people wouldn't even notice that this is necessarily that bad of posture until you start paying attention to like key landmarks on the body, right? You start to see that like, obviously this is not in a great alignment, but the ear here is like, if you draw that like 90 degrees straight down, it's not even lining up with the side of your, with your side of your top of your scapula, which it really should be. Your ear should be kind of in line with the acromion process there. So, all right, so going back through, just mentioning the spine again, I know we already talked about it, but you can't talk about the spine too much. So it is all of your vertebrae, right? So you've got 24 altogether, 7 cervical, which are going to be up here, 12 thoracic, which is sort of the largest section, and then 5 lumbar. And then I love that, I think they didn't mention this in the other one, but they mentioned it on this one. You do have like, it says 5 sacrum. It's not, it's all one big bone at this point, but these are like a whole bunch of fused little bones together technically, like when they like initially start growing, but then, it all becomes like one big triangular shaped fused bone. So it says 5 sacrum, it's really not, it's kind of just one. And your tailbone here, right? Your coccyx. Similar situation there. So when we're talking about what's kind of cool, we got to talk about the first two cervical vertebrae, which are the ones like at the very, very, very top, because they're actually pretty special. If you look at all your cervical vertebrae, they're going to look kind of like any other disc, right? They're going to have the same bony processes as our other ones, right? You can see, actually, that's not the one I want. You can kind of see they have sort of your classic bony shapes as the other ones, but these upper two are special, right? This very top one right here is called your atlas vertebrae, and the bottom one is called your axis vertebrae. And you'll notice there's a little gap here. This is one of the coolest bones in your body. The way your atlas and your axis vertebrae actually intersect with each other is one of the most important like biologic and evolutionary things that the human body ever did. And the reason this is kind of cool, if you ever read one of my favorite books, it's called Born to Run, right here. They actually mention this. I mean, you'll hear this in lots of other, not Bruce Springsteen, this one here. But if you ever get a chance to read this book, it's kind of fun. It's got one chapter where it talks about like human evolution and how we evolved in such a way that we are meant to be long distance runners. And lots of people have talked about this in other places, you know, and this guy is not like a physiologist, and he's certainly not like an evolutionary biologist. But he does mention at one point in such a way that's so easy to understand, and it's very fun in this one chapter about 3/4 of the way through the book. And what he talks about is how these two vertebrae here are so unique, right? Your atlas and your axis vertebrae, because they allow us to keep our head upright and we can still open our jaw when we are running. And there are very, very, very few animals on the planet that can actually do that. So when you think about like, and this is a sentence you'll hear me say, I've said this before, but man, humankind is the fastest land animal on the planet if you give us enough time. And that sounds surprising. Like, I know it's like, whoa. Like, you know, we got like cheetah is the fastest land animal on the planet, right? Yeah, in the short run, cheetahs are sprinters. Humans are long distance runners. So if you give us enough time, we can travel more distance than any other animal, which makes us the fastest, right? And part of that are these really cool evolutionary gifts that we have. Number one, we have a metabolism that can do it. We have all kinds of like enzymes that make us great at it. So that already is like a huge leg up. We'll talk more about enzymes in like physiology classes. But we also have the ability to sweat on the go from our entire body. So we can vent heat through our skin in this massive surface area. Your dog, whenever you run a dog around, you know, that's why they have to stop and they're like, they're like panting. That is them venting heat because they can only sweat through their tongue. They can't sweat out of the rest of their body. So they are venting heat by opening their mouth and dropping their tongue outside, which is cooling them down. But it's a very small area compared to the size of their entire body. We're able to do it with our entire body. And that's amazing, right? And here's the other thing. We are able to open our mouth. We can run while breathing through our mouth. Whereas a lot of animals cannot do that. When they start running, their vertebrae are not specially designed to keep their head upright. So they get into a locked position like this, which clenches their jaw down, and they can't vent heat. They can't like breathe through their mouth when they're running. And so humans can do that. We got huge advantages here. We also look at your glutes and some other stuff that's really fun, but we don't need to talk too much about the rest of it. But that's like a really fun gift that we have, and that's thanks to the special shape of that atlas and axis vertebrae here, right? So this is your axis vertebrae right here. And this is your atlas vertebrae. So your atlas vertebrae, you'll notice, is a little wider, and it's got this really big base of support. I've said this before in class, but does anybody remember why it's called your atlas vertebrae? This is just for fun. So your atlas, if you look at atlas, was basically a survival game? No. So Atlas was one of the Titans that Zeus like defeated in order to like, you know, claim godhood and stuff. and he punished Atlas for being a Titan by having to be the guy who holds the world up. So in Greek mythology, it was believed that Atlas was the one holding the world up. And so that is why it is called your Atlas vertebrae, because it's holding your head up, which is kind of fun. And so that's how you can remember that as your top vertebrae. And that's also where you see the statue of Atlas. It's kind of a famous, actually, I don't think that's actually it. Here's the original Atlas one. Yeah, there's that one, which is really cool. Anyway, I think that's always a fun fact that makes it easy to remember. And then we've also got our axis vertebrae. And your axis vertebrae is just below it, and that's the one that creates the little hole so that you can have like the pivoting, right? And so you can see the little vertebrae can reach up through this little hole here, and it can do this like pivoting motion, right? So those are the top two parts of your cervical spine. And it's where a lot of your muscles are going to attach to. Now, we do want to really quickly, before we keep moving forward, I want to mention some variations of the spine, right? So let's look at some variations of like spinal curves, right? So really quickly before we talk about it, let's talk about what a normal spine curvature looks like, right? So curvature of the spine, natural. So when you look at a normal curve, right? This little curve up top, that's your cervical curve. This one right here is your thoracic. And then this is your natural lumbar arch, right? So all of that is very normal, right? Like that's the normal curvature of our spine. But we've got some variations of this here, right? This one here actually is sometimes called your lumbar curve, but it's also sometimes referred to as your lordotic curve. And what you will sometimes see are what we call like, we're kind of calling them syndromes or isses, right? You can see what is called lordosis here. And that's an exaggerated curve of the spine, which we've talked about in the past as sometimes caused by an anterior pelvic tilt or just a hyper exaggerated curve here. It's that Instagram booty posture. That is what we call lordosis. Then we also have the rounded shoulders up top. We're going to call that kyphosis, which you can see here, and that's a rounding of the upper back. So lordosis is an increased posterior concavity, meaning that there's just a big dent in the low back of the lumbar and cervical curves. And so it results in two things: increased low back arching and increased spinal extension. So what ends up happening is because you are seeing so much curvature forward, now all your weight is tipped forward like this, right? Which would mean that you would kind of stand at a weird angle like this. So what happens instead is that your upper back then does way too much spinal extension to compensate, and that gets you, stacked back onto, I would say, natural posture, but not natural posture, but at least some type of balance, right? So because there is so much anterior tilting here, we see extension in the upper back here. And that's why the overactive muscles on an exaggerated lower cross syndrome, we look at those, when we look at the what muscles are overactive, right? We see tight muscles in the hips and tight muscles in the upper back, right? So the anterior tilting from the pelvis is causing the posterior side to erect the spine even more. And that's why like those spinal erectors, your erector spinae, right, are overactive in the back. That's pulling the pelvis up, which is tilting it even more. And then the anterior side, we see the hip flexors be overactive. So that's an exaggerated lordotic curve, or sometimes referred to as lordosis. Then one of the other common ones, did somebody have a question? Did I just hear somebody? Or am I hearing voices? I might be hearing voices. All right. The other one that we're going to see is kyphosis, right? So kyphosis is an anterior concavity, so that's a caving in the front of the thoracic curve. And so when we look at kyphosis, oh man, look at that. That's really intense. We see like rounding in the front, right? So that's an increased concavity there, right? So there's our increased kyphotic curve. And then what your head has to do to kind of compensate is it has to like kind of crane forward so that it's like trying to get back up top because of that decreased balance, right? A lot of times you will also sometimes see in kyphosis, people will get like a butt tuck down here, also to kind of maintain balance, right? Simultaneously. So your body is trying to, make up for both of those things at the same time. Again, it's just trying to get it all like stacked into like balance, right? So increased upper back rounding and increased spinal flexion. So your spine is flexing, right? So that's a kyphotic curve. Now, sometimes you will also see lumbar kyphosis, which is a reduction in your normal, normally we're supposed to have a lumbar curve, we're supposed to have like a nice natural curve down here, but sometimes you will see an increased kyphotic curve down below, right? So that's going to be lumbar kyphosis, which is going to look, this one's actually probably going to be a little harder to Google. Flat posture. Yeah, there we go. So sometimes you'll see posterior pelvic tilt, which is low back rounding. And so like, we'll have like way too much curve, but then sometimes you'll have the exact opposite, which gives you this kind of flat back posture. This is a little bit of like something I struggle with actually. Basically, it's from really tight glute muscles and really tight hamstrings. And so it pulls your pelvis down in the back. That's a posterior pelvic tilt. So that is lumbar kyphosis instead of like thoracic kyphosis. And you can see like all these pictures of people. It's like, look, stretch your hamstrings. So that is what we see there. And then we do have scoliosis as well. And scoliosis is lateral curvatures of the spine. So sometimes this can happen. Sometimes this can happen due to like a compacted sacroiliac joint, which makes one leg quote unquote longer than the other. The legs are actually the same height, but you can see here, right, there's just slight curvature happening. And so somebody will lean ever so slightly to one side. Look at like the gap between his arms here. You can even see like this gap is wider than this gap, right? He's just slightly leaning this way. And so the muscles, there's probably compression on this side of his SI joint, and this SI joint's being pulled in, so he's got a low hip over here and a high hip over here. That'll also sometimes result in rotational movements in the spine as well. Ooh, there we go. But yeah, you can kind of see scoliosis they're actually fairly common, especially in like one-sided like athletes. You'll see scoliosis develop in like tennis players sometimes. You'll see scoliosis develop in people who have like construction jobs. And scoliosis is something you're born with in traditional scoliosis, right? Like that is structural scoliosis. If you were born with a curvature of your spine, like if you've been dealing with it since you were a kid, you're born that way, your spine is shaped that way. Sometimes that can, result in surgery, but sometimes like you can do certain therapies. But what we're talking about is functional scoliosis. Functional scoliosis is where like what I was dealing with, I had a really bad impact at Frisbee, which resulted in like me kind of favoring one side for a couple weeks. And so I had like a lateral curvature temporarily. That's functional scoliosis. Not born with it, but it can happen. So, and you'll see, like I said, in construction workers, they work on one side. If they're used to carrying stuff on one side, you'll see lateral curvature sometimes. So that's our main movements. We got lordosis, which is increased low back arching in the low back. Kyphosis, which is upper back rounding. Lumbar kyphosis, which is lower back rounding. And scoliosis, which is lateral curvatures. Any questions on those guys? Nope. All right. So with any of those, that's going to change like the amount of space between your discs. If you look at like kyphosis discs, let's see here. I do want an X-ray. Oh, there we go. This is great. So take a look right here. look at how much space is between these discs. Like very limited space here, huge gap over here. Limited space, huge gap. When you look at like spinal X-ray, if you look at your spine in a natural neutral position, there is supposed to be about an equal amount of space between all of these discs, you know? Like this is pretty decent, you know? Like this person's got, except for here, that's like a little bit of, you know, you start to see a little bit of compression, right? So your discs, when they have like lack of space between them in a lot of ways, that's what often causes like a lot of these pains, right? Aches and pains. So your intervertebral discs are meant to have a little bit of compression that can happen between them, but you got things like, you can see blood vessels running through here. You've got your nuclear pulsus, you know, that little space that's in between there. And so as we get older, you know, due to like bone density decreasing and things like that, and then like just, you know, getting older, your tissues get a little softer and easier to tear. We start to see a lot of problems in our discs, right? Particularly in the cervical spine if you have low bone density issues. And so, you know, when we're looking at that, right, your spine is designed, each of those joints are designed to be able to flex, extend, rotate, and laterally move. And so that's why we have lateral flexion, which is this. We've got lumbar flexion, we've got lumbar extension, right? We are meant to be able to perform all of those movements. But if we can't, because there's not enough space between each of the discs, it'll feel like you're hitting hard tissue, which is very, very, very painful. So we want to make sure that we keep all these muscles. We want to know these muscles so that we can know how to stretch them, so that we can kind of keep these nice and loose here. So starting off, this is actually my favorite muscle because this name is just so intense and I just love it. It sounds like a dinosaur, but it's my favorite muscle in the body. It is the sternocleidomastoid. And the reason it's called the sternocleidomastoid is because you can see there are some fibers that start on the manubrium here, which is part of your sternum. And then some of your fibers start on your clavicle and it runs up and inserts right near what is called your masseter, which is in charge of mastication, which is breathing. So it is your did I say breathing? Oh my God, it's your masseter, which is chewing. That's what mastication is. What? So this is your sternocleidomastoid, which I think it sounds like a dinosaur. That's why I love this muscle. So sternocleidomastoid, or SCM, which is what most people are going to call it, by the way, because nobody wants to say sternocleidomastoid, but it's your SCM muscle. And its job is to concentrically accelerate cervical flexion, rotation, and lateral flexion. So this muscle is very good at this and this and this, right? Especially this one right here. Like the Quagmire from Family Guy, right? Little head bob. Sternocleidomastoid is really, really great at that. Here's the thing though, when it contracts, it's very good at this, not just this, which means when we want to look down, what we'll often do instead of just looking down is we'll go like that, which is very bad for our cervical spine because it puts way too much pressure on the discs. What's up, Noel?
How you doing? Giggity, giggity, giggity.
Yeah.
Quagmire.
Right. Yep, that's the sternocleidomastoid muscle. If they drew him accurately, he would have a huge neck. So that's the SCM muscle here. Now, this is definitely one of our very, very, very overactive muscles on our upper cross syndrome muscles. So if it's in charge of rotational movements, lateral flexion movements, and translation movements like this, if we know that that's what it does, we need to stretch it out by doing the opposite of those things. So one of the best ways to stretch your sternocleidomastoid is to look to one side and up. And just that little bit of stretch actually will put that there. Now, if you want to make that more intense, the version that's in your textbook is actually not my favorite version of this stretch, but the version that's in your NASM book is where they will actually take your arm and you'll reach it up over your head like this, and you drop back like that. And that's decent. You'll feel like a stretch there on the front of the neck. I like that one. Me personally, my favorite SCM stretch is actually I like to take my hand back here and create like a little gap, and that allows me to, you notice how like I want to elevate my shoulder? What I'm going to do is I'm going to drive my shoulder down. And then I'm actually going to take my other hand and I'm going to depress my collarbone slightly. I'm going to push my collarbone down while I'm doing this. And then I just like to look up. And that's a really great stretch. You'll feel it right on the front of the neck there. Alternatively, without doing the arm tuck, you could also just reach with this arm. And so both of those are really good SCM stretches. And you just do the same thing on the other side. So that's a sternocleidomastoid. It's right there on the front of the neck. Then we've got your scalenes, which you're not going to be able to see, by if you were to like peel back your skin, you wouldn't be able to see your scalenes because they're trapped. You can see a little bit of them, but if you look at like scalenes, if you look at your neck musculature here, your scalenes right there, this little group of muscles right underneath here, but your upper trapezius is for the most part covering a good section of that. And then you can see here a lot of like your sternocleidomastoid and stuff is covering that there. So they are kind of hard to see. These are a slightly deep muscle, but that's your scalene group is actually, it's actually a couple, like several muscles there. By the way, there's your masseter, right? This is the one that's in charge of chewing. This is the one that gets really tight, by the way. If you've ever gotten that, like you eat something sour and you cramp up right here, there's that muscle. So, although I better stop talking too much because we're about to get it. Like it's not like a mover muscle. It's like about to step out of my territory. If it doesn't move the body, I do not remember it. So your scalenes is a little group that also does cervical flexion. So this is also slightly in the front, so it does a little bit of that, although it's not really what they're known for. It does a little bit of rotation and lateral flexion. That's what they're a little more known for. So it's this and this. But one of the things that's really cool about your scalenes, or I guess you could even say like not so cool about your scalenes, they assist in elevating this top rib right here during inhalation. So it actually raises this like rib underneath your collarbone up ever so slightly when you take a big deep breath in, which is a good thing until we are stressed out, which we happen to live in a world of way too much stress. So I'll take a little tangent here to talk about stress. When you are stressed out, what often happens is you start performing shallow breathing patterns. This is something that's very common. And I don't know why we're programmed this way, but it's just something that we do. So like, think about even just like cartoons, which draw people in a very exaggerated way. You see like a cartoon character and they're angry and stressed out or mad, right? They always do this. They draw them like that where they're moving their shoulders like crazy. That's actually fairly accurate. That's actually kind of how we move when we are stressed out. We just don't look like we're doing this big exaggeration, you know? And so what'll happen is when we are stressed out, we will often elevate here and we'll do these little tiny short breaths. In fact, you can totally like stress yourself out by just doing that too much. Anybody in here who might suffer if you've ever had a panic attack, that often happens because you are exhaling way too much CO2. And it's because of these little shallow breathing patterns. And so that changes your blood chemistry, which makes your body go into fight or flight mode, which causes you to further tense up.
Curious yourself? Good.
And it has like
Buy now at littlepassports.com.
What's up, Noah?
To order.
Yeah, I used to have them short breaths too, like especially when doing our Hell Week or something like that.
Oh,
play
sure.
Football, because it was especially when it was hot. I have asthma.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So when I run too heavily and don't catch that second wind, that's when I start off with that heavy breathing and all that deep breathing, you know, a little shortness of breath for getting dizzy, you know what I'm saying? It's the second wind that gets you, you know?
You feel all that tension up here. It almost feels like there's like lactic acid in your neck, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing about that, right, is that's actually from like improper breathing patterns. And it's like, you know, a lot of athletic coaches, we spend all of our time teaching people how to squat, but we never spend any time telling people how to breathe. And that's a huge part of exercise, right? Breathing is hugely important. So, you know, what we want to do is we want to encourage our clients to use their diaphragm and breathe into their lower abdomen. So send their breath down. You know, I'll tell my clients all the time, like, use your leg lungs, you know. Breathe into your legs. No, there's not actually lungs in your legs, of course not. But like, try to send your breath low so that you use your diaphragm when you're breathing rather than breathing into your chest, because that means that you are not expanding and bringing in as much air as you can. And so it can lead to like chemical changes in your body. It can lead to more stress hormones getting created in your body, which is bad, right? Like that's a very negative thing. And so this is one of the reasons why we see people who it's a feedback loop, right? It's where something creates something, which starts the thing that initially started that loop, and then it just keeps going, right? You get somebody who gets stressed out, so then they start breathing shallow, and when they start breathing shallow, that changes their blood chemistry, which stresses them out, which, you know, and then it's the big feedback loop. So your scalenes are a big part of this. This is definitely a muscle we want to stretch. And the stretch for this is really, really, really similar to how we stretch our upper trapezius. So again, they are in charge of rotation and lateral flexion. So one of the ways you can stretch your scalenes, just take your head over to the side like this. I like to actually take my arm up just to give it a little bit of weight, but I'm not pulling on my head. I'm just using the weight of my arm to kind of gently give this a bit of a deeper stretch. Then you're going to take your opposite arm and you are going to reach away, almost like your keys are on a table down here and you're like, come on, just almost there, you know, like, so I'm tilting like this, I'm reaching down. And then if you actually look at the way some of the muscles on the outside travel here, there's a connection between like your deltoids and your rotators here. So what I like to do is I like to flip my palm into that anatomic position, so palm face up, and then I will just slightly bring that back as I'm reaching away. And you're gonna get a nice, super deep stretch in your neck. And as a bonus, you'll actually probably feel a little bit in your bicep as well. It's not a bad bicep stretch. So that's how we're gonna stretch your scalenes there, okay? That little bit of like arm pull away depresses that rib. Versus like elevating it, right? So that's your sternocleidomastoid on the front. That's one of your scalenes on the side there. Now, talking about the front of the neck here, we have some of our underactive muscles, which are these this muscle right here. This is your deep cervical flexors. This is another sometimes confusing muscle, but this is a muscle right on the front of your neck. And so your deep cervical flexors are going to be right here. This is your longus colli and your longus capitis. And there's these little cervical flexors here in the front. These are actually weak muscles. These are actually lengthened muscles. And this is another example of like why, this is the reason it's confusing, because sometimes you're like, wait. If it's on the front, shouldn't that be overactive? Because that's pulling me this way, right? And so again, not in this case. This is actually an example of a synergist muscle that's being inhibited by, an agonist muscle that is being inhibited by an overactive synergist. So your deep cervical flexors accelerate cervical flexion. So that's literally that's why they're called the deep cervical flexors. And so the same thing is true of your longus capitis, which is starting in the back, and then it runs around to the front there. And so you can see the longus capitis here, right? So these are your deep cervical flexors, right? They are on your cervical spine, and their job is to do this. Their job is to allow you to look straight down, okay? So they tuck your chin. Notice how I'm looking down right now, but my head is still, for the most part, like up top on my body, right? I'm looking down like this. I got the crazy double chin, right? That's what this is in charge of. This type of motion right here. My sternocleidomastoid is in charge of this. See how that's very, very, very different? One is my head rounding me forward, and one is me just looking straight down. So when that overactive sternocleidomastoid starts to take over, when we look down at something, we don't double chin it, we scoop it, right? And that's what's so bad here. So That's why a muscle on the front, which is kind of surprising, is a muscle that we want to strengthen. So how do we strengthen it? Well, we actually just do slight chin tucks. And this is actually something I can't really demo very well because I can't get my camera all the way to the floor. But basically, one of the ways you can strengthen your deep cervical flexors is simply doing little chin tucks. So, not this version here. That's actually not what we want to go for. But what he's doing is you want to lift your head up like he's got it here and then lay the back of your head down. One of the ways you can do this as a test, if you guys want to do this on call right now, one of the ways you can tell if you have a forward head posture is to just lay down on the floor, like nothing underneath you. Make sure that like you're nice and flat on the floor. And if you notice that as you are laying down, you are kind of looking behind you, right? Like your head's laying down like this, and you can kind of see your eye line is going back here instead of like straight forward on the ceiling. Like if I was laying down, right? Imagine I'm laying down right now. If I were looking like this when I'm laying down versus looking straight ahead, my eye line's going back behind me. That shows that like you've got a rounding of your neck here. Your neck came forward and then you laid the back of your head here. We want to lay this part of our head onto the floor. So we can basically, what he's doing is he's going to lift his head up like this and then raise his head back like that, right? So he does a little chin tuck as he lays down. And that is one of the ways you can do this. You can also just take your hands behind your head, lift like that, and then lay it back down. And you will notice that will actually feel like you're contracting here and you're stretching out these muscles in the back of your neck. It's a great exercise to do. I do recommend doing it. You can see here, he's got a, I don't know if it's like a scale or what, but he's got an ever so slight elevation. What I like to do, I actually don't have it with me, it must be downstairs. What I like to do with my clients is use my wallet. Your wallet is usually just about the right thickness. So I will have my client, I would honestly, you know, so many sessions every day. I just whip my wallet out. I'd have my client lift their head up. I'd put it right into the back of their head and have them lay straight back down. And that little bit of thickness is perfect. A thin book, a couple magazines, that's about as the right thickness there. Other versions you can do, you can also roll up a towel, which can give you that little bit of concavity that you might need. That's another very effective version. So that's one of the ways to work on your deep cervical flexors. You can also do, you'll see sometimes people will do, I'm trying to find it, I can't believe I can't find a picture of it. Sometimes you will also see people actively do exercises like this. You could actually do that where they actually focus on doing little chin tucks, right? That's one way to kind of strengthen those. Yeah, I can't believe I can't see it. Sometimes you'll also see people put a tennis ball under their neck. Yeah, not a single picture. So sometimes you'll see people do that as well. They'll take a tennis ball and they'll hold it between their chin and their chest. So all of those are ways to turn on these underactive muscles. So you would stretch your scalenes, you would stretch your sternocleidomastoid, you can stretch some other ones that we're gonna look at in a minute. And then you would, you do the tennis ball tuck, or you could just do the simple, chin tuck there. And they're great. They're really, important. We've talked about doing like wall angels in other classes, right? That exercise where you get on the wall, heels touching, butt touching, and then elbows and wrists touching, and you reach as high as you can, up and down like this. That's a great exercise. Back of your head should be touching as well. So gets a good chance to kind of turn on those deep cervical flexors. Now, back to our commonly overactive muscles we need to stretch, right? We are going to look at one of the biggest ones here, which is your levator scapulae. We started talking about this muscle a little bit yesterday, but your levator scapula is this muscle right on the back here. It is in charge of elevating your scapula, right? So it attaches to this, this ridge right up here, and it's in charge of motions like this. So it accelerates cervical extension a little bit as well. So it does do a little bit of this, little bit of this, but its main job is to assist in the elevation and downward rotation of your scapula. So two things that we are literally trying to avoid in most good posture situations, right? So, you know, with an overactive levator scapula, you're going to see somebody who brings their shoulders up like this and then rotates them forward like that. And so now our scapula is in this rotated position here, and we can't raise our arms up overhead, right? So we need to stretch that. How do we stretch it? Well, like I said, it does lateral rotation. I'm sorry, it does ipsilateral rotation, which means that like if I want to stretch this side, it contracts this way. So if I want to stretch it, if I want to, sorry, if it contracts on this side, it turns me this way. So if I want to stretch it, I need to turn this way. So I'm going to contralaterally turn my head, take my arm up like this, and just very gently pull down, and you'll feel that deep stretch right back here. Another thing, remember, it's in charge of elevating. So this is another situation where we want to drive our shoulder down on the opposite side. So I'm stretching like this. The other thing is I don't want to like crane my head forward while I'm stretching it, right? So I'm going to tuck my chin as I gently pull that down, and then I'm going to pull back here. And you'll feel a nice deep stretch right here on the back of the neck. Awesome. This is a great one. For those of you in relationships and your significant others, like, can you give me like an extra rub? It's like, yeah, I totally can. You give them a little massage, and I was like, now stretch. And they'll feel way better than they would have if it was just massage alone. So that's a really great one. That's your levator scapulae there. Couple other muscles that we got to talk about in the cervical section. We already talked about them yesterday, so they're listed, but I didn't put their actions or anything. You do have your rhomboids again. So like particularly these little minor these fibers up top, right? That does a little bit of scapular downward rotation as well. The rest of your rhomboids do upward rotation, right? That gets you back into a great position. But these upper fibers sometimes are responsible for it, and that's why you'll sometimes see some physical therapists and some massage therapists, sometimes they'll kind of dig into these upper fibers. But for the most part, guys, really, you should know that you know your rhomboids as like scapular retractors. Don't really think of them as too much of a rotator. That's in kind of very advanced cases. Really, if we're just trying to like understand what our muscles' main jobs are, it's mostly, you know, the correct type of rotation, right? It's just that these little itty bitty fibers here can sometimes be troublemakers. And then your upper trapezius, right? We're right back to this bag freaking overactive muscle, right? Our shrugs, right? Way too much shrugging. So upper trapezius, right? These big fibers up top here. This is another one that we're going to stretch very similar to our scalenes by just taking our head directly over. Now with the scalenes, right, we were focusing on like driving the head down. We did this like little bit of like rotational movement, right? So that's your scalenes. This is your regular trap. They are almost identical stretches. The only difference is I need to start doing my left side because I've been demoing on my right all day. You guys are gonna see me like come into class tomorrow like this. So you can see a lot of time. A lot of times when you're doing this, you know, you're literally just taking your head straight over, right? Scalenes, it's that little bit of rotary movement. But in this version, it's just directly over at the side. So there is a slight difference there. So looking at our angles, right, we've got the sternocleidomastoid, right? So we're gonna go, we're gonna reach the arm down and we're gonna depress the collarbone. I like this version here. You're gonna look away. Sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, upper trapezius, levator scapulae. Okay, those are all of the neck stretches we want to go through, and I'll pull up a picture of that just in case. So levator scapulae stretch, upper trapezius stretch, sternocleidomastoid stretch. So you can see each of the angles here. Oh, look at that. Here's the NASM one. Heck, let's do a video. So she's going to do, oh, she's doing the elbow version. All right, this is, This is not in your textbook, by the way. This isn't the version they do in your textbook. The picture in the back of your book is going to be just arm down with the head around like this. But I like what she's doing. This is my favorite version. So she's got an upward look right here. So she's stretching right on the front of the neck there. Let's see. Let's keep it going. Let's see if Nassim's got the other one. Yeah, they do. Look at this. Good job, Nassim. This is their YouTube channel. And so there's your classic upper trap stretch. Slash scalenes, right? I mean, your scalenes are getting a little bit of this as well. If you want the scalenes, you just got to do an ever so slight upward look, and you need to drop your arm down actively because it's a rib elevator, right? So she's just kind of letting this arm relax. But if she were to drive her arm down, that would depress that one rib. Let's see, can we go for 3? I'll go to the channel specifically. Levator scapulae stretch. Awesome. Hey, there it is. Although she's not doing the arm one. Okay, so she's just taking her arm back. She's just doing this. That's good enough. I personally like to give myself a little pull, which is also, that's the version in your textbook. But this isn't bad either. So back of the neck, side of the neck, front of the neck. All 3 of those hugely important to loosen up so that we can get those cervical flexors. So what we would do is we would stretch all of those, right? And then we would follow that up with little double chins, you know? That's what's going to be real good for us. It may not be sexy, but it's very good for us. Then we got our middle trapezius, which is part of this conversation as well. Remember, your middle and lower trapezius are also commonly underactive muscles because when we see that forward head posture, it's often caused because of shoulder rounding. So we need to loosen that up to get us to contract those muscles that draw us back into that upward posture there, right? We want to get everything nice and stacked. See how my ear is in line with my acromion process, that little knob on the outside as it hooks around my scapula, right? My ear is in line with that as my shoulders are pulled back slightly. That is the posture we're looking for, right? Not this, right? This is also not what we're looking for, you know, like that kind of thing. We're just standing nice and tall. And that's a great way to make yourself look, 3 inches taller. So contract those middle trapezius. That's going to be rowing motions where we pinch our shoulder blades back. And then our lower trapezius, this is a huge muscle to strengthen because we spend all our time with that upper trapezius pulling us this way. The lower trapezius is going to pull us this way, right? So remember, lower traps depress the scapula, upper traps elevate the scapula. So even things like, even things like just scapular pull-ups where we go from here to here, just that little bit of contraction is hugely important. So if we're talking again, let's just go back to that upper cross syndrome. Let's look at, now that we understand a little bit more about this anatomy, let's look at these tight fibers, right? So we see weak lower trapezius muscles. We see weak rhomboid muscles. We see weak serratus anterior muscles, right? Remember, the serratus anterior is that one that rotates us like this, right? That shoulder protraction. Meanwhile, we see overactive, right? We just go across. These are weakened. These are too tight. Our tight muscles are the pectoralis major, right? That big pec muscle rounding us forward, and our pectoralis minor, which is the one that's rotating our scapula downward. So both of our pec muscles, right, overactive. And we see an overactive sternocleidomastoid, right? So right on the front of the neck, the one that's rounding us forward like that, right? Meanwhile, our weak muscles up top that are inhibited are those deep cervical flexors, right? So those are going to be underactive. Those are the ones that help us look down without reaching our head forward. And then we go across to our, so that's the weak muscle up top. Really, there's only the one. We had a lot of weak muscles down here, but just your deep cervical flexors, really deep in the neck. And then tight muscles up top, we see a tight upper trapezius, a tight levator scapulae, right? And then they don't have it mentioned here, but tight scalenes as well. They don't mention it because it's kind of part of the upper traps in a way. So those are our overactive, and let's take a look at that on our overhead solutions table, and you can see what I mean. Is that the right one? Where's the right one? There it is. So here we see upper body, arms fall forward, shoulder elevation, forward head posture. This is our overactive list. This is our underactive list. So you can see in clients who have arms falling forward, right, or which is associated with shoulder rounding, the lats, that makes sense with the arms falling forward. That's actually one we haven't talked about today. But then we see the pec major, pec minor, and then we see those rotators as well. That rotator cuff teres major pulling us inward. That's another overactive one. So arms fall forward isn't quite part of the cervical spine, but these are some other muscles where we see the pecs again. But forward head posture, right? Levator scapulae, shoulder elevation, levator scapulae, and this is weird. They have a weird typo here where it says sternocleidomastoid levator. This levator should be on the next line. It should be over here. So levator scapulae on both these lists. Forward head, shoulder elevation. Sternocleidomastoid, forward head, shoulder elevation, right? And then we see forward head scalenes. We see shoulder elevation, upper trapezius. So we need this stretch, and that stretch. All three of those hugely, hugely, hugely important with our upper crossed syndrome clients. All right, do you guys have any questions about those before we move into kind of talking about the agonists for all these movements? Is any of that confusing? Everybody know how to do those stretches, hopefully, or at least, you know, dip your toe in the water. Okay, so let's look at our movements here. So we've got spinal flexion, right? We got cervical up here, and then we got lumbar down here. So lumbar flexion is like your crunches. Cervical flexion is your head. Then we got spinal extension, right? Cervical extension, lumbar extension. Then we have rotation, right? So you've got cervical rotation and lumbar rotation, right? Then we have the muscles that are responsible for those. So for cervical flexion, your sternocleidomastoid does do that. Why is your deep cervical and your deep cervical flexors should be here as well. Sternocleidomastoid's a big one, right? Like that's that making your head crane forward. But your deep cervical flexors are the ones we want to use, right? Do the double chin, guys. The double chin is so good for you. Then we got cervical extension. That's going to be muscles like your erector spinae, right? Which is pulling a lot of that cervical extension, right? That's a big one. It does run all the way up to the top. So there's your cervical extensors there. Then we have lateral flexion, which is the side-to-side motion. And your erector spinae is actually going to help with that as well. But the main one here is going to be your sternocleidomastoid, which again is going to explain why this muscle is so tight, right? Your sternocleidomastoid, multiple jobs, more likely to be overactive. So sternocleidomastoid there. And then we are also going to see, like I said, the erector spinae. Then we get your cervical rotation, right? Which are these motions here, right? And that is definitely going to be the SCM again. That is your list of agonists. Like I said, it's a bit of a shorter one today, but the neck can sometimes be complicated. So if you guys have any questions about the neck stuff, please don't hesitate to ask. I find these angles sometimes a little confusing, just because they're all very different from each other and very important to memorize. Do you guys have any questions today? Noel, Nicholas, Robert, questions, comments, concerns?
Nope.
It appears you are in much better spirits.
Well, thank you, TV. All right. Tomorrow is our final exam. So you've got homeworks 3 and 4 are up on Canvas. I know Raph was having a little bit of trouble getting on the video last night. Did you guys, is the video, it should be up and working now. Is anybody having trouble with that video on Canvas?
I haven't checked it yet. I'm not sure.
Okay. If you have any troubles, let me know. I checked it this morning and, you know, proofread my work and it should be working, but we'll have cervical spine up in a little bit. So you guys can have that up there. Like I said, our final is going to be tomorrow. So we'll do a little bit of a review with that and make sure that everybody's feeling comfortable. Flashcards, if you guys want to get them, I'm going to put that PowerPoint with all the flashcards up on tomorrow's lesson again, just so you guys can have it and see it again. I know a lot of you already got it in your email and stuff, but just want to make sure it's always around and easy to find. So for any of you who want to, you know, do that for your extra credit, or just do it for yourself, it's so helpful. Just knowing like those movements and like lateral flexion, that's the upper trapezius, right? Like rotation, that's also the upper trapezius. Just knowing each of those muscles, that's super helpful. But if that is all we've got today, I'm gonna let you guys out of here and you can relax and study up for tomorrow. Yeah, that's it, guys.
We'll be doing the quizzes tomorrow, right?
Yeah, we're gonna do the quizzes tomorrow. Just because, like I said, I'm coming down with a cold, and I want to make sure it's just a cold. I would have done like another meeting tomorrow, and we would go through like a lot of upper body stretches tomorrow. But I think we're gonna have to push that to next time, just in case. I'm getting a COVID test in about an hour, just to make 100% certain I don't have anything. And once I'm sure I don't have it, we'll plan the next workshop.
Sounds good then. Hopefully you test negative for that one.
I'm sure I will.
Yeah, man. Good luck on that one, man. You know?
The worst, honestly, guys, the test is gonna be worse than how I'm feeling. You know, freaking thing just shoved into my brain. And then you know, like I'll be, you know, I probably do have a cold though. Like I'm pretty sure I'm coming out with just like a cold, and so I'm like, ugh. So I'm gonna be a little cranky for the next few days. I'm a little bit of a baby when I have a cold. All right, I'll let you guys out of here.
All right, you guys have a good day.
You too, man. See ya.